Bernard Haykel, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure.
Of course, a fair amount of controversy in the meeting between Biden and MBS. You know the Saudi Crown Prince personally very well. What happened that you did not actually expect?
So the thing that happened that I didn't expect is the lack of preparation by the American team. I'm very surprised that President Biden and his team went there and came back with so little from the Saudis, that they hadn't agreed to something in advance. And that this was a total win for the Saudis in terms of PR, in terms of reaffirming the centrality of Saudi Arabia in the Middle East. It's a complete victory for MBS and for the Saudi government, Saudi state.
Now, I mean, I understand that it's a big deal to get the American president to come and visit, but did I miss, were there announcements from the Americans that actually moved the ball from the Saudi perspective?
Basically, the stuff on Iran, that, you know, there's a commitment to never allowing Iran to have a nuclear weapon, that America will help defend Saudi Arabia from attack on its territory, presumably from Iranian proxies, especially the Houthis in Yemen. You know, all of that is music to Saudi Arabia's ears. And the Saudis were able to show that they have tremendous convening power. I mean, they were able to bring all the GCC leaders, the leaders of the countries of the Gulf, and the Iraqi prime minister, the king of Jordan, and the president of Egypt. And it just signaled that Saudi Arabia is simply the most important country in that region, and that you need it both for the stability of the region as well as for global energy stability.
If we were talking a few years ago, of course, the Qataris certainly wouldn't have been in that group. That's one of the bigger things that has changed, is the fact that the GCC feels more unified, more aligned. Do you think that is stable?
It's very hard to say that it's stable because, you know, these are highly personalistic regimes where individuals can wake up one morning and decide one thing that runs counter to the past. But what I get from the Saudi leadership and also from the UAE is that there's been a steep learning curve, and that, you know, playing the kinds of games that they played with boycotts of each other and so on are very counterproductive. And so, for instance, now they've wired the electrical grid of Iraq to the GCC, or they're about to do that. That's a very good thing. It brings Iraq out of, you know, partially out of Iran's orbit and into the GCC orbit. So I think there is some maturity there. And that's something that the Americans have encouraged, and I think rightfully so.
We can get into the big geopolitics, but I want to ask you a little bit about Mohammed bin Salman himself, because, you know, he has been one of the most controversial, provocative figures on the geopolitical stage globally. And some of that has been revolutionary in a positive sense. Some of that has been revolutionary in a very negative sense. How do you make sense of that from a global perspective?
So, look, I mean, he represents a phenomenon that we see in other countries as well. You know, a very strong nationalist populism, a strong authoritarian streak. I mean, we see this in India, we see this in Turkey, and other places, as you well know. But in his case, I think what's happened is that he really had to consolidate his power and centralize his power. In order to do that, he's had to emasculate large numbers of the royal family, including the key individual that was America's favorite, that is his cousin, Mohammed bin Nayef, who is, you know, the darling of the CIA and British intelligence and every other Western intelligence agency.
And then was under house arrest for, you know, years, right?
He's had his wings clipped. Okay, let's put that, you know, putting it politely. And many others have as well. He's also had to completely and radically change the business as usual in the country, which involved a tremendous amount of corruption and stealing from the treasury, from elites, including members of the royal family. He's had to also emasculate the very reactionary forces in the country, the Islamists, the hardcore Islamists, who are the only ones who can mobilize large numbers of people in the streets against him. So that consolidation effort was extremely brutal and messy at times, and it involved, of course, the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. I think now all of that is pretty much in the past. He's very much in power and will become the king unless he's assassinated. So he can rest a bit easier.
Biden claimed that he brought up the Khashoggi issue with MBS. MBS, in return, said that he talked about Abu Ghraib and other American human rights abuses, the Israeli slaying of a Palestinian journalist recently that they denied officially. Is this relationship ever going to have meaningful discussion on human rights?
So the problem with the issue of human rights is whenever you raise it with the Saudis, they see it as an intervention in their domestic sovereign kind of affairs. And they'll always turn around and say, who are you to tell us? You invaded Iraq, you did this, you did that, you droned people in Afghanistan. So I think, it's best if you have those conversations. I think those conversations ought to be had, that they be had, sotto voce, not in public. That you will get much more out of the Saudis if you speak to them privately and insist that these are issues that matter, and that in fact they're not only just good for America, they're also good for Saudi Arabia.
So can we at least say that MBS is less likely to directly order the assassination of journalists going forward?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think that they will ever do anything like that again. And look, frankly, I'm going to say this, I think in some ways the Khashoggi murder, tragic as it was, in a way saved a lot of other journalists from being killed. I mean, the blowback from that event was so serious and I think demoralizing for the Saudi leadership that they will never do that thing. They'll never do that again. I mean, that doesn't mean that they won't, try to extradite people and put people in prison and all that. They will. But this kind of rogue operation, I think, is in the past.
I want to get to the upside, but first, when you say it's all in the past, I mean, just in recent months, we've seen mass executions, some of which involve people that were arrested when they were children. This doesn't feel like it's all in the past.
Well, it's still a very repressive and authoritarian regime. The individuals in question that we're talking about, there are some 81 of them. Half of them were Al-Qaeda and ISIS individuals. Some of them fairly high-ranking people.
Yep.
No one will shed a tear in the United States, or shouldn't shed a tear for those guys. The other half are Shiite dissidents. And there, I think, yes, you're right. There are some people who certainly did not deserve execution. But this is a repressive regime, and he's engaged in a massive overhaul of the country. Look, I was there just this weekend on a beach in Jeddah. There were Saudis in bikinis everywhere. The change is just unbelievable. Impossible to have predicted. And that's just the tip of the iceberg of the kinds of changes that have happened. You see women everywhere working in the workforce. You see women who are uncovered, unveiled, in positions of power and influence. You see young people who are super excited about him. And I think that he's basically banking on the bulk of the population that's under 30, that's young, and that thinks he's a rock star because of the things he's doing. Anyone over 40 hates him because he's taking away the entitlements and changing the modus operandi of the country.
And most of the country is indeed very young.
That's right. I counted the ones over 65 are like 3% of the population. He frankly doesn't care about them.
Do you think that Saudi Arabia has sort of cracked this problem in terms of the need to Saudiization? Historically, it's really hard to get young Saudis and many young people in the Gulf to actually work. There's an enormous amount of entitlement, diversification of the Saudi economy. Even 5 years ago, I'd have leaders from Saudi Arabia tell me that diversification meant petrochemicals as opposed to just taking oil out of the ground. Are they really, do you believe that he has passed the point of no return on that?
He has no choice. He has to get away from oil because that's just, it's unsustainable. Relying on oil in the way the country has. Now, whether he has the human capital, he's able to change the culture of the country, that's not something that can be done overnight. That's going to take a generation, maybe two. So the jury's out on that. And it's not unique. By the way, the problem is not unique to the Saudis. You see it in all rentier states across the world, in Latin America and everywhere. So he really has a very, very hard task.
It's not unique in Saudi Arabia, but in some ways it's most dramatic. It's a large population. It's a huge amount of oil wealth. It is very cheap to get out of the ground. I mean, so, it's easier to sit on your laurels if you're the Saudis.
Absolutely. And in fact, the test will be right now, because right now he's raking it in. The country is raking it in because of the price of oil. And typically what happens in the past in Saudi history, political history, in political and economic history, is when times are good and oil is flowing, you kick the can down the road and you don't make the changes that need to be made. That involve taxation, that involves removing the subsidies and all kinds of other entitlements. Now, this is where we'll see if he holds the line and doesn't succumb to the easy kind of throw money at people to keep them quiet. If he doesn't succumb to that, then he's serious.
Now, let's go back to the Biden trip itself. You say that the Americans didn't get anything from the Saudis. The one concrete decision that was made, it's small, but it's symbolically important, and there have been a number of them from around the region. Of course, Biden's plane came directly from Israel, and the Saudis have said that they're opening airspace to everyone that's licensed, meaning that the Israelis can now fly through Saudi airspace. That actually seemed like a real policy shift. Well,
I would describe it as crumbs, giving crumbs to Biden, because that was already baked into the Abraham Accords, into the agreements that they had made with the Trump administration. If you remember, Israeli airplanes could fly and were flying over Saudi Arabia to go to the UAE and to Bahrain and to India. Those are the three countries that they'd given permission to. They just now opened it up in return for, an Israeli agreement, which again was also baked in earlier for the Tiran Island, which is that island that is between Saudi Arabia and Sinai, Egypt. All of that had been agreed to before. So, I see it as cosmetic. I don't see it as substantive.
And of course, it does not include the Israelis and the Saudis having an agreement to open diplomatic relations formally. The Saudis have been saying privately that they weren't ready to do that. Why aren't they ready to do that? There's so much engagement happening between the two countries.
I think there's a sense that the Saudi public, and you have to remember, this is although it's an absolute monarchy, it has a finger on the pulse of its own public. It is a kind of like a tribal political structure, and they feel that their public is not ready for that yet. And I think they will not do it until something is given to the Palestinians, something that is, respectable. But, look, the Saudi-Israeli relationship is going to get warmer and warmer as the Iranians, increasingly decide that, both these countries and the regimes of both these countries need to be toppled. Iran has been the single most important factor in bringing these countries together. And that's not changing.
What do you think the implications are for the Saudis if and when the Americans and Iranians make it clear that they cannot come back to the nuclear deal?
I don't think the Saudis, or the Israelis for that matter, are very keen on the JCPOA, on the nuclear agreement with the Iranians, because they feel that there aren't substantial teeth there. There isn't enough there. And in fact, with the withdrawal of the sanctions, the Iranians will get lots of money, and then they'll do more. They'll spread more mayhem through proxies in the region.
I guess you could argue that even though there weren't many concrete accomplishments from the meeting, that the Saudis are moving in a direction broadly that is more aligned with U.S. national interests, both in the region and more broadly in terms of the countries that they engage with. And so, to the extent that's the case, you would expect that there would be a warming of relations between the two countries.
Yeah, I think the Saudis are a status quo power. They're not a revolutionary power like Iran is. They're very keen on stability in the region. And this has very concrete implications. So right now, for instance, as you know, the price of wheat and barley and so on has gone through the roof because of the war in Ukraine. So what the Saudis are willing and able to do, alongside the other GCC countries, is to give money, lots of money, to the Egyptians and to the Jordanians and to the Sudanese and other countries that need money to buy foodstuffs to feed their own people, including Yemen, by the way. And so the single largest threat to stability in the region are bread riots across the region. And this is where the Saudis can play a hugely important role in subsidizing the food, because bread is subsidized in these countries. So I think the Saudis are on the same page with the Americans here. And this meeting basically puts a lot of the kind of virtue signaling that was going on before over values and human rights, it basically puts an end to it and says, look, we have core strategic interests in this region. This country is really important for the United States. We have to go back to business as usual.
Bernard Haykel, thanks so much for joining us.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you.